and welcome back. Before we jump into part 2 of the best stories from the 80s Twilight Zone, quick heads up, I've got a Patreon page where you can watch all my content, excluding my gaming videos, ad-free, and if you want to check out the full series for yourself, I'll drop a link in the description down below. But with all that out of the way, let's get into some spooky stories. Our story is titled Nightcrawlers, from Season 1, Episode 4, originally airing on October 18th, 1985. Our story starts off on a dark and stormy night. A sheriff named Dennis Wells pulls up to a roadside diner and hurries inside, anxious to get out of the downpour. A waitress at the diner notices a look on Dennis's face and asks what's wrong. Dennis shakes his head and comments about a massacre nearby that has him and everyone at the sheriff's office a bit spooked and on edge. The cook's eyes shoot to attention as he asks what massacre. Dennis asks if they've been listening to their radio. The waitress says they haven't, and Dennis continues. He says a motel up the road was so shot full of holes that it looked like the aftermath of a war zone. 4 people died, and the whole building and all the cars in the lot were burned to a crisp. He says all the bodies they found were in defensive positions or were hiding, as if they knew something bad was coming. But Dennis shakes his head and says it didn't do them any good. Dennis guesses that it was a gang-related thing. Maybe the owner fell in with the wrong crowd and stole something, or something worse, and the warpath was retribution. He says he doesn't know for sure, and that it's all guesses at this point. The waitress, looking worried, asks if there was a gang. Would it be heading their way next? Dennis shakes his head, saying it's just a theory at this point. But likely, the gang would have left the area in a hurry after pulling off such a grotesque stunt. A station wagon slides into the parking lot at high speed, the headlights blinding everyone inside the diner. A man, his wife, and their young son rush into the diner, eager to escape the wind and the rain. He comments that they're from Denver and trying to pass through town on the local highway. Dennis comments that with the storm blowing through, they should have stopped at the hotel back on the state line a few hours back. The man says that his wife said the same thing, as the power in the diner flickers and the wind howls outside. Dennis says that in storms like this, it's best not to risk it. He offers to escort them back to the state line after they finish eating. The man nods his head and thanks him, before the young boy asks for a cheeseburger, cutting off their conversation. 2 cars nearly crash on the road outside the diner. 1 car spins out and quickly pulls into the parking lot. A man dressed in dark clothing steps out. He enters the diner soaking wet, and Dennis is at full attention, noticing something seems off about the man. The stranger sits down at the counter and orders coffee. Dennis tells the man that he was driving a bit too fast for such crappy weather. The man doesn't argue. He just agrees and politely apologizes. The stranger gets a refill on his coffee and takes 2 pills from his medication bottle, popping them in his mouth and downing them with a quick gulp. Dennis looks on, asking the man if he has a prescription for the pills he just took. The stranger says that he does, while looking over at Dennis. The waitress offers the man another cup of coffee, but the man comments that he's about to get back on the road. Dennis cuts him off, saying that he thinks that would be a bad idea, continuing to say that he wouldn't like the way he was driving on a nice day, let alone during the big storm raging outside. Dennis looks over at the family eating, telling the stranger that he's about to escort the family to a hotel for the night, and suggests that the stranger does the same. But the stranger declines, saying that he'll be spending the night on the road. Dennis, trying to probe for information, asks the man if he's running from something. He says that he isn't, and that he just likes to keep moving, while he flicks open a lighter that says Nightcrawlers etched into the top of it. The waitress says the name out loud, and again, Dennis, trying to pry, asks what the name means, thinking it might be gang-related. But the stranger says it was his unit's name in Vietnam, but he says that he'd rather not talk about it. Dennis says he understands how he feels, saying that he wishes that he'd have gotten the chance to fight the commies, but was medically barred from selection due to being flat-footed. Dennis's ears perk up and he moves closer, asking the man if he was in infantry. The stranger slightly raises his voice, asking if Dennis heard him. Then he repeats that he doesn't want to talk about it. The waitress, growing tired of Dennis's poking and prodding, tells him to leave the stranger alone, but Dennis won't relent. He continues to ask question after question, getting mostly one-word answers. But the stranger finally tells him that his unit was sent in early to recon certain villages, to identify enemy positions and report back. He repeats all this while fiddling with his Zippo, saying that he feels shame. Dennis apologizes for pushing the subject. The stranger stands up, saying that he should be on his way, while paying his small tab. Dennis stands and gets in his way, putting his hand on his chest, telling the man he meant what he said about going to the hotel. The man shouldn't be driving in the storm. The stranger finally begins to lose patience with Dennis, asking him what his problem is and what the hell he wants, saying that he just wants to leave. He came home after walking on the bodies of his friends. He gets uncomfortable staying in one place too long. The cook, knowing the stranger's name, calls him Mr. Price, asking him to calm down and reminding him that the war is over and he shouldn't bring it back with him, trying to cool the heated situation. This does seem to sway to a cooler response. Price looks Dennis in the eyes, telling him that this storm is nothing compared to what he's seen, recounting that he was in worse storms with mud up to his knees, in pitch blackness, and surrounded by enemies that wanted nothing more than to see him and his squad dead. He recounts that they got ambushed on all sides, and the enemy opened fire from every direction. He remembers hearing the screams of his men, and the sound blood mixed with rain makes when it hits the mud. He recounts when he got wounded in the leg. He said it was the worst pain he had ever felt, until a second bullet ripped through the center of his hand. He says it made him drop his weapon. He reached down through the guts of his own men to retrieve his rifle, and summoned all his strength to run as fast as he could. He couldn't hear the screams of his men anymore. He knew he was all that was left, but decided to run rather than fight an outnumbered and unwinnable battle. He remembers stepping on the dead bodies of his friends to get himself out of the mud, and how it scarred his mind. He says that many of them were dead, but that their bodies just hadn't given up yet, saying he remembers hearing a few of them gasp for air as their bodies went under the mud. He tells Dennis that every time someone like him says they understand, or that they wish they had been there, is a fool, because people like him will never know what it was like, or even come close to understanding. Everybody in the diner watches as Price continues to dress down Dennis over his comments. He walks past Dennis, pushing him aside with his shoulder. Price apologizes to the family for disturbing their dinner and asks the cook how much he owes. He pays his bill and goes to walk out the door, but Dennis steps in his way yet again, telling Price that being a soldier doesn't give him the right to be disrespectful to the law. He tells him that he can't allow him to drive after taking medication, and that he needs to go with him and the family to the hotel and get a good night's sleep. Price says that if he goes to sleep at that hotel, a bunch of innocent people are going to get hurt or worse. He says the last time he fell asleep at a motel, a little piece of the war that he brought back with him did a lot of damage and people died. Dennis looks on in shock, asking about what he just said, remembering the massacre that happened at the motel up the road. Price says that he and a few other vets can do it. In fact, he's beginning to get really good at it. Dennis asks what the hell he's talking about. Price turns to the cook and asks if they have T-bone steak on the menu. The cook laughs and says no while shaking his head. Price, wide-eyed, says to make his medium rare. Before a T-bone suddenly materializes onto the grill, everybody looks on in shock, before it disappears just as quickly. Price repeats that he's getting really good at it, saying that it doesn't last long unless he's asleep, then they last as long as he dreams. It becomes clear at this point that Price can physically manifest things with his mind. Dennis, in shock, asks if it's some kind of trick. Price continues that it's no trick. He and 4 other soldiers that returned home have the same ability. He says that they've theorized that there must have been a chemical or some type of weapon that they had accidentally been exposed to. He says if they were using it, it would explain how the enemy appeared to be in so many places all at once. Dennis steps forward and asks about the motel he fell asleep at. He asks what happened there. Price says he was locked in a nightmare that he couldn't wake up from. But when he did, there was fire all around him. A soldier kicked down his door ready to shoot him dead. Price begins to become manic as he recounts the event. He turns to Dennis, telling him that he really shouldn't be here, that it's dangerous for him to stay. Dennis draws his gun and aims it at Price, and almost just as quickly, Dennis screams out in pain as steam begins rising from his hands. He drops his sidearm to the floor, where it begins to melt. Dennis grabs his hand, screaming in pain as burns and blisters begin to appear. Price thanks the waitress for the coffee and goes to leave, but Dennis grabs a bottle of ketchup and smashes it over Price's head, knocking him unconscious. The man and his family run outside, desperate to escape the danger of the escalating situation. They see a military helicopter land nearby. Everyone inside the diner begins hearing gunfire and the sounds of explosions. The man and his family rush back inside, desperate to escape the bombs and gunfire. Undead soldiers emerge from the darkness, looking more and more ghoulish as they reach the light. The undead soldiers continue to open fire as they close in on the diner, blowing out windows and destroying walls. Dennis tries to flee in an attempt to save himself from the undead army's wrath, but is swiftly gunned down. The cook is about to be gunned down next, but the waitress comes in clutch at the last moment, hitting the undead soldier with a cast iron pan. The cook is about to use the same pan to kill Price with the hope that killing him will stop his waking nightmare, but he's hit in the shoulder before he can bring the cast iron down on Price. All of the undead soldiers slowly walk in and surround Price. They look down at him and without hesitation mag dump all their rounds into him, both completing their final mission and gruesomely fulfilling Price's nightmare. With Price dead, they all disappear in a quick flash of white light. But the burning remains of their onslaught remain. The young boy finds Price's Nightcrawler's Zippo covered in the ash of the diner and picks it up as the diner burns down all around them. An ambulance arrives to take away the injured, and firefighters battle the blaze. The waitress comforts the cook as he screams that Price said there was more. More soldiers just like him that returned from the war. More soldiers that could end up causing the same thing to happen. He continues to scream out for more as he's loaded into the ambulance and taken away as the screen fades to black. When it comes to Nightcrawlers, this isn't just another episode. It's one of the darkest and most intense stories the series ever produced. The episode is based on a short story by Robert R. McCammon, published in 1984, which means it was a very modern and raw piece of horror at the time. Unlike many older Twilight Zone adaptations, this one already had a gritty, psychological edge, making it a natural fit for a more serious and grounded interpretation on screen. The teleplay was adapted by Philip DeGuere, who found the story relatively easy to bring to television because of how visual and cinematic it already was. That cinematic feel was pushed even further by director William Friedkin, best known for The Exorcist. Friedkin approached the episode like a full-scale film rather than a typical TV segment, which is a big reason why Nightcrawlers feels so intense and grounded compared to other episodes in the series. That commitment to realism also made it one of the most expensive episodes of the entire run. Instead of relying on miniatures or cheap tricks, the production used real explosions, practical effects, and full-scale destruction, especially during the episode's chaotic finale. The diner itself was partially filmed on location for the exterior shots, while the interior was built as a studio set, allowing the crew to fully control lighting effects like the constant lightning flashes that add to the episode's tense atmosphere. Behind the scenes, Friedkin's directing style was just as intense as the episode itself. According to the crew, he pushed actors extremely hard to get the performances he wanted. In one case, he even got an actor Scott Pollin's face and physically shook him to provoke a more emotional reaction, which left a strong impression on everyone involved in the production. Even the music had an unusual background, with contributions connected to members of the Grateful Dead and harmonica work by Huey Lewis, giving the episode a unique and slightly offbeat sound compared to typical television scores at the time. When it finally aired, Nightcrawlers stood out, but not entirely in a good way for the network. The episode was considered extremely violent and disturbing, especially since it aired during a time slot when families were more likely to be watching. Its heavy themes and graphic intensity were seen as a mismatch for that audience, and it's often cited as one of the episodes that pushed the limits of what television viewers expected from the Twilight Zone in the mid-1980s. At its core, the story is deeply rooted in the psychological aftermath of the Vietnam War. William Friedkin himself described it as a metaphor for how the war continued to haunt those who lived through it. The so-called Nightcrawlers aren't just monsters, they represent trauma, fear, and guilt made real, turning the episode into something far more meaningful than a standard horror story. In the end, Nightcrawlers feels less like a typical episode of the Twilight Zone and more like a short war horror film, combining high-end production, intense performances, and a message that was far heavier than most TV audiences were expecting at the time. Personally, I loved the narrative storytelling. None of the horrific things that Price recounts about the war is shown on screen. It's just words, with the only visuals being the haunting figure lurking outside the diner and the intense and disturbed look on Price's face. It makes it feel real all the way up to the point of the supernatural final standoff. But that's all I have for you in this one. Thank you for watching, and a very special thank you to our channel members. Take care, stay safe, and make sure your next trip to a diner doesn't leave you lost in the Twilight Zone.